If you think the Kentucky Derby is just a 2-minute horse race, you're missing out on the actual heart of Louisville. This year, Kentucky Derby Festival is officially celebrating its 71st anniversary, but the road to get here was anything but a straight line. To understand why 1.5 million people descend on this city every spring, we have to go way, way back before the fancy hats and the billionaires, all the way to a version of the festival that is now largely a footnote in history. Between 1935 and 1937, local merchants and civic leaders tried to launch a Derby Week. It was not just going to be a casual gathering, it was a sophisticated attempt to boost a city struggling through the tail end of the Great Depression. They hired a man named Arnold Jackson to direct the first festival in 1935. Jackson was not your average event planner. He was a British general and an Olympic gold medalist who won the 1500-meter race in 1912. He brought a sense of international prestige to Louisville, and for a few years, Derby Week was a whirlwind of boxing matches, concerts, and fireworks. The centerpiece was the Carnival Night Parade on 4th Street, but you wouldn't recognize it today. There were no, cars or motorized engines. Instead, the floats were pulled by horse and mule teams through the downtown streets. But nature has a way of resetting human ambition. In January 1937, the Great Ohio River flood, the river crested at over 52 feet, putting 70% of the city underwater and leaving 175,000 residents homeless. Churchill Downs itself was nearly used as an American Legion relief center. And while the track was eventually spared the worst of the damage, the Derby Week Festival was completely washed away. It was considered a failure, and for 19 years, the idea of a massive civic celebration was considered too risky to revive. The city was described as sick and tired of being sick and tired, and the dream of a unified festival sat on the shelf, at least until 1956. That year, 4 men sat down for a midday meal and changed Louisville forever. These were not, corporate giants, but they were 4 civic-minded volunteers with different perspectives on the city. You had Addison McGee, who was a public relations expert, Earl Ruby, a legendary journalist for the Courier-Journal, Ray Wimberg represented the Chamber of Commerce, and Basil Commissar was a dedicated civic volunteer. They knew the horse race was a global icon, but they felt the city itself was being left behind. With a meager budget of exactly $640, they founded the Kentucky Derby Festival. And their first move was to stage the inaugural Pegasus Parade. Why Pegasus? Well, they chose the name Pegasus, the winged horse of Greek mythology, because it represented the winged horse of the Muses, which is the symbol of magic, energy, and the soaring inspiration they hoped to bring back to a city that had just been put underwater just 2 decades prior. The first parade in 1956 was led by Charles M. Pat Jones, who rode a magnificent white horse named Silver that he had bought from Dixie's stables. At the time, the parade was mostly horses and very few floats. It started on 9th and Broadway and moved east, attracting about 50,000 people who sat on the curbs because there were no bleachers or grandstands yet. From those humble horse-drawn beginnings, the parade began a massive technological and cultural evolution. By the 1960s, the festival was adding events like the Great Steamboat Race, which in 1963 pitted the Belle of Louisville against the Delta Queen in a high-stakes river battle that brought the city back to the waterfront. By the 1970s, the festival was professionalizing. In 1973, they introduced the Great Balloon Race with only 7 balloons. And they launched the very first Pegasus pins. These pins were simple plastic, and they only made 10,000 of them as an awareness campaign, and today they are the primary source of funding for the entire festival. The 1980s saw the birth of the biggest spectacle of all, which was the beginning of Thunder over Louisville. It started in 1989 at the University of Louisville football stadium as a simple opening ceremony, but moved to the waterfront just a few years later in 1991. It quickly ballooned into the largest annual fireworks and air show in North America, requiring massive logistical coordination, including center markers right there in the middle of the river just so the stunt pilots could safely navigate the air show. As the festival grew into a $204 million economic engine, it also had to navigate the complexities of a changing city. The parade moved from horses to high-tech televised floats that cost thousands of dollars to build, and it began hosting grand marshals back then like John Wayne and William Shatner and Gladys Knight. But the growth was not without friction. In 2016, the Pegasus Parade, which was the founding symbol of community, was halted when a shooting broke out downtown, wounding 2 teenagers. Socially, the festival has spent the last decade working to correct its own history. For a long time, the festivities felt exclusive to certain neighborhoods, leading to the controversial Derby cruising bans in the mid-2000s that sparked federal lawsuits over racial profiling and the closure on Broadway. In response, the festival eventually launched the Derby Equity and Community Initiative in 2022. The centerpiece is the West Louisville Block Party, a massive free event that finally brought the winged horse back to the West End. Then history repeated itself in the most literal way possible. In 2025, exactly 88 years after the 1937 flood destroyed the original festival, the Ohio River reached historic levels again. For only the second time in history, with the first being the 2020 pandemic, Thunder over Louisville had to be canceled. The waterfront was underwater, and the river's speed meant that the firework barges couldn't even be safely placed. While a sober moment for the city, it also highlighted the resilience that has defined the festival since 1956. Now here we are again in 2026, celebrating over 70 years of the Pegasus. The parade has changed from mule teams on 4th Street to multi-million-dollar broadcasts on Broadway, but the mission that McGee, Ruby, Wimberg, and Commissar set out remains the same. It is a study in natural scale and the quiet power of community that refuses to stay underwater. Whether it's the sound of a steamboat whistle or the roar of a jet over the waterfront, the festival remains one of the pulses of Louisville, which is a soaring spirit that started with $640 and a white horse named Silver.